Well, hello and welcome. I'm David Legg. Welcome to the 23rd session in this NOSL program on global health, sustainability and security. And today we're going to be talking about a particular problem and a particular proposed solution. The problem is the really serious inequality in the availability of vaccines, the inequitable distribution of vaccines for COVID around the world. And the proposed solution is a waiver of the TRIPS agreement proposed by South Africa and India. So we're going to work through this. Don't be put off by the unfamiliar language. It'll all become clear, I promise. So I'll start by screen sharing, and then I'll go to the PowerPoint. And let's see how we go from here. So the heart of the matter is the inequitable access to COVID-19 vaccines, the consequence of which is going to be, and is being, that there are thousands of preventable deaths in those countries which do not have adequate access to vaccines. The second consequence of this is the ongoing cultivation of variants which may be more lethal, more transmissible, and less susceptible to current vaccines. How has this come about? How should it be managed? What is the TRIPS waiver proposal? And what position should Australia take in the World Trade Organization about the TRIPS waiver proposal? This is a graph of access to vaccines, access to the share of the population who've received at least one vaccine dose. So you can see that the high income countries are around about 30%. The middle income countries are around about 5%. And the low income countries are around about 1%. So we'll talk about the overview of the pandemic itself, a little bit about vaccines, and then explore why this inequitable access to vaccines has come about and the supply limitations. And then we need to go to a little bit of background with WTO, the World Trade Organization, and the TRIPS agreement before exploring this South African-India waiver proposal. So the epidemic started in Wuhan in early December with these cases of unexplained pneumonia. By the 10th of January, the virus had been isolated and sequence published. By the 30th of January, WHO declared a public health emergency of international concern. And the epidemic in China peaked at around 3 cases per million in mid-February. It came down to 0.01 case per million by April and has remained there ever since. So let's now turn to this Butte Interactive website called Our World in Data to look at the pattern of the epidemic. So this is a picture of confirmed cases in China based on a rolling average, and it's expressed as relative to population. So you can see that it peaked on February the 15th. By March the 18th, it was down to 0.002, and it is, as we speak, around 0.01, and has been very low ever since. Okay, we could also look at this on an absolute number basis. So it peaked at at 4,600 cases per day in mid-February. Let's now turn to a few other countries. China is still on this graph. This is now, let's make this confirmed cases, rolling average relative to population. So China and Australia are down here, relative population. This is Australia over here, I think. Yeah. But as of now, relative to population, the number of daily cases confirmed is very low compared to the United States, around 100, Europe around 150, and India, as of late last week, 238 cases. But if we do it on an absolute numbers basis, you can see India way ahead, peaking at 391 cases, 391,000 cases per day as of May the 16th. Okay, so let's look briefly at deaths for the same 4 countries, 4 regions. And again, these are absolute numbers, confirmed deaths, the 7-day rolling average. And you can see that India is up here with 4,000 almost confirmed deaths per day. Europe is down at 137 cases per day. Sorry, did I get that wrong? So India on relative population is 4,000 cases per day. Europe is down to 1,300 cases per day. The US on 500, and Australia and China both on 0 cases, deaths per day. These are deaths. Sorry. And if we look at it on a relative to population basis, the EU and India are neck and neck. The United States is down, it has been higher, and Australia and China are still 0. Okay, so let's go back to the PowerPoint. Now let's go back to the vaccines. So I've got another interactive website. This is the Unicef vaccine market dashboard, which has got some very useful tabs. If we go to products, you can see and we look at all vaccine developers. You can see by developing country, by vaccine platform. Let's look at my vaccine platform. You can see the number of vaccines using the protein subunit, the number of vaccines using a non-replicating viral vector, that's the AstraZeneca one. These are the 50 or so mRNA vaccines, only 2 of which have been approved for use, but there's quite a lot in the pipeline. Let's look at agreements. What this shows you is all the advanced purchase agreements by country and region. And it shows that the European Commission has by far outbid all the other regions and countries in terms of acquisition of doses. So on this scale, they've secured almost 3 billion doses. The Covax facility comes next at 1.6 billion doses, and we'll come back to Covax in a minute. The US with 1.3 billion doses, and the different colors represent the different developers of the vaccine over here on the right. So let's look at price. And on this one, you can see the prices that let's do it by vaccine manufacturer, the prices that the vaccine manufacturers are selling at. So CanSino, which is one of the Chinese vaccines, was sold to Pakistan private providers for $27 per dose. The AstraZenecas range from Philippines, public supply in Philippines at $5 per dose, and selling to the European Commission at $2.19 per dose. We could look at Pfizer, the RNA vaccine, selling to the United States at $19 a dose, selling to Tunisia at $7 a dose. So you get a sense of the cost of these vaccines. They range, let's say, between $3 and $30 per dose. For countries, big countries with low budgets, this could be quite difficult. Okay. So the way in which the distribution of vaccines has been determined is by these bilateral advance purchase agreements, which started as early as June last year, where countries were aware of the most promising vaccine candidates and were buying up stock in advance with prices which really didn't understand the nature of the cost. So the prices were actually quite generous. And those countries which could afford to buy up bought up in great amounts. So the EU, UK, US, Canada, Australia all bought buckets more vaccine than their population could possibly handle, on the off chance that some of the vaccines would not prove to be effective, some of the vaccines might have side effects, and there might be supply delays. Okay, in the US, as well as these advanced purchase agreements, there was this amazing Operation Warp Speed, whereby the Trump administration spent over $10 billion over a few months to accelerate the development of the vaccines in the US. In addition to that, there was this structure set up for the global supply called the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator, the accelerator we'll call it. And this has 4 pillars, 1 pillar for vaccines and 1 pillar for medicines, 1 pillar for tests. And the pillar for vaccines is based on 2 organizations. One is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, or CEPI, which gives grants to support vaccine development. And the other is the Covax facility, which is organized through Gavi, the vaccine organization. And this arranges for donor-funded advance purchase agreements for low-income countries and lower middle-income countries. So the Covax facility is, as I say, run by Gavi. It depends upon the rich donors, rich countries, and the big philanthropies, such as the Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Foundation, based in England. And it does deals with 2 sets of countries. First of all, the self-funded countries, which it could include high-income countries and upper-middle-income countries, who commission a volume of doses from Covax. A price range is agreed to, and there's a 10% down payment. And then the second group of countries are the funded countries. For these countries, the advance purchase agreements, or the advance market commitment, it's sometimes called, is funded by donations to Covax, again, largely through the rich countries and the Gates and Wellcome Foundation. And there is a volume promise of up to 20%. The Covax facility also then has a relationship with the vaccine suppliers, and Covax negotiates advance purchasing agreements with the suppliers, specifying a price and a volume as negotiated, which then are either on-sold to self-funded countries or are distributed to the funded countries up to 20% of their population needs. The budget for Covax for 2021 is 18 billion, of which only half has so far been raised. So part of the problem of the low-income countries not having vaccines is that the Covax facility has not been properly funded. So what we're looking at is this so-called vaccine nationalism and the rush to herd immunity for the rich, But herd immunity for the rich in the present circumstances means no immunity for the poor. And it means the pandemic continues to rage in the low and middle income countries, leading to more deaths and more variants, as we said before, perhaps more lethal, more transmissible, perhaps of different antigenicity. So the pandemic will continue and perhaps merge from pandemic to endemic. The second part of the problem is supply. And the question is whether vaccine supply has been deliberately limited. That is to say, if there is manufacturing capacity out there which has not been used. And this is probably the case. In May last year, the WHO set up this structure called the COVID Technologies Access Pool for sharing of know-how, but the big pharmaceutical companies refused to participate. The idea was that they would put a pool in a public place where other manufacturers could draw upon that expertise and add to the global production capacity. But the Pharma has also refused to negotiate voluntary licenses directly with other production enterprises. So, for example, there's a large vaccine producer in Bangladesh who claims to have written to all of the big Western pharma companies offering to produce their vaccines, offering under voluntary licenses, whereby he gets a license to produce them from the owner of the intellectual property and pays a royalty to the owners of the property. So is it the case that intellectual property rights are preventing the scaling up of vaccine production? The final point under this heading is the fact that vaccines procured via the Covax facility are proposed to cut out at 20%. And it appears that that may have been inserted at the insistence of Pharma because it prevents the emergence of a powerful monosonic purchaser, which could keep prices low, which is not what Pharma wants. So in October 2020, the South African and Indian governments in the WTO, the World Trade Organization, proposed that countries be allowed, that WTO waive IP protection on COVID technologies, including vaccines, for the duration of the pandemic. So this would mean that if countries could legislate to suspend their domestic IP protections, and they would not be subject to TRIPS sanctions if they did that. The TRIPS intellectual property protections encompass patents, copyright, design, and know-how. The waiver would only apply to the COVID pandemic and COVID technologies, and only for the duration of the pandemic. And of course, countries would have a choice to either use or not to use the waiver. The waiver has been strongly opposed by the rich countries, and the optics globally are not good. First of all, there's been a manifest lack of solidarity, the rich world heading urgently to achieve herd immunity while the poor world, the pandemic continues. Secondly, that it's so counterproductive because the variants are proliferating while the pandemic continues. Thirdly, it's not a good look in geopolitical terms because China has been going slowly on domestic vaccination while selling its vaccines or even giving them away across the third world, while the rich countries are hoarding their vaccines, not funding Covax, and opposing the waiver. And finally, it's under the heading of the optics not looking so good, is the way in which the rich countries are protecting pharma, enabling it to restrict supply in order to maintain prices, and protecting pharma from the impact of the proposed waiver. By way of background, we need to talk a little bit about the WTO, the World Trade Organization. It was established in 1990 to help regulate global trade. The way it works is that it looks after a range of international agreements on various aspects of international trade, including trade in goods, trade in services, trade in agriculture, and this particular agreement, relating to trade-related intellectual property rights. Up until 1994, between 1947 and 1994, there was only one global agreement, and it was called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which only dealt with trade in goods and didn't touch agriculture. Okay, so the TRIPS agreement, prior to TRIPS, the trade-related intellectual property agreement, prior to TRIPS, many countries had no IP protection. Some countries protected the intellectual property and the process, but not the product. So if you could reverse engineer the product using a different pathway to produce it, you could do so. And some countries, most countries, had much shorter periods of protection. But with TRIPS, a set of TRIPS sets out a range of principles regarding intellectual property rights and the provisions for protecting intellectual property rights, including patent protection for both the product and the process, and 20-year patents. Now, the TRIPS agreement was actually driven by Big Pharma, and Pfizer in particular played a major role, as well as being driven by the rich countries, in particular those who play host to big global pharma companies. The way it works is that the TRIPS agreement must be enshrined in domestic intellectual property law, and if they're not, the country is exposed to sanctions under the WTO arrangements if another country opens what's called a dispute against that country. TRIPS is a core part of the WTO package, and if you were to refuse to sign up to TRIPS, you wouldn't be able to access the benefits of all the other, if there are benefits, of all the other agreements. So, for example, you might well be unable to sell your products because they face higher tariffs because you are not participating in the total package. Now, the TRIPS agreement also provides, it doesn't specify the way the law, the domestic law, is to be written, and leaves certain flexibilities open to national legislators. And these flexibilities include compulsory licensing, which is where the government can give a local generic company a license to produce something, even if the owner of the IP is not willing, so long as the receiver of the compulsory license is agreeable to paying an appropriate royalty. And compulsory licensing for export, meaning that in which case both the exporting and the receiving countries would need to issue a compulsory license. The use of TRIPS flexibilities has been strongly opposed by the US, with quite serious international sanctions applied to stop countries from either legislating for TRIPS flexibilities or using them. Okay, so then what is this waiver proposal? In October 2020, South Africa and India proposed that the WTO allow countries to waive IP protections on COVID technologies, including vaccines, for the duration of the pandemic. If the countries were to legislate to suspend domestic intellectual property protections, they would not be subject to TRIPS dispute processes or sanctions. The forms of intellectual property which are encompassed by the proposed waiver would include patents, copyright, design, and know-how. However, it would only apply to COVID technologies and only for the duration of the pandemic, and countries would have the choice as to whether they wanted to deploy this waiver. The promise of the waiver is that the country adopts the waiver, local manufacturers volunteer to make the vaccine, or if there's medicines, to make the medicines. Arrangements are made then for the development of technological and manufacturing capacity that might involve additional capital, it might involve technology transfer, and the vaccines are then produced both for domestic use, but they could also be produced for export. The opposition to the waiver has been opposed, questioned, delayed in the WTO, in particular by the US, the EU, Japan, and Australia. There were three arguments. First of all, Big Pharma claims that intellectual property protection is not a barrier to production. Secondly, Pharma claims that existing TRIPS flexibilities could be used to scale up production. And thirdly, that intellectual property is necessary to incentivize innovation, and the waiver would damage pharmaceutical innovation. So what I propose is that you check out the readings that I've listed in the document for this session. Check out the arguments responding to these claims and see what you think. So we're looking at a range of strategies for scaling up production to overcome inequitable access to vaccines. One is increased pressure to properly fund Covax. This is happening all the time, but the countries with the money are being very slow to agree. Secondly, we could agree to the waiver and make provision for supporting technological transfer and manufacturing capacity. Thirdly, there is a thing called the Covax Manufacturing Task Force, which is trying to voluntarily negotiate a platform for sustainable vaccine manufacturing. A fairly similar initiative is being run through the WTO, where the Director General of the WTO has convened meetings with manufacturers to look at ways of scaling up production. And then suddenly, in May 2021, Biden supports the waiver. And that has made a big impact on this whole controversy. Although Biden is only supporting the waiver for vaccines, and this would exclude medicines. The US position has been supported then by the Pope, by New Zealand, and by, of course, dozens of low and middle income countries. It's still opposed by the EU, by Germany, and by Pharma. It's been welcomed by Australia, but we don't quite know what that means. And it's not completely clear what the next step is. And if it's a good idea to use the IP waiver for vaccines, it probably would be a good idea to do so for therapeutics. So if new medicines emerge tomorrow, it's not clear what we would do if medicines are not included in this process. So the current state of play is that the conflict within the WTO continues. We don't know where Australia is going to go on this. An agreement with a limited waiver looks likely, although it's not going to happen very quickly. But we don't know what's going to happen about effective medicines. If the waiver is adopted, there will still be a need for technology transfer and developing manufacturing capacity. Full funding of Covax would make a big difference, but production capacity would still need to be scaled up because Covax is presently limited by supply limitations. And what should we do about the next pandemic? Okay, so what I want you to do from here on is a little bit of further browsing. I've given you these two interactive websites, which I'm sure you'll enjoy checking through and finding out how they work. I'm hoping that you'll scan the readings, in particular trying to respond to those 3 questions raised or arguments raised by Pharma against the waiver, and see what you think about them. And then I've got 2 exercises for you to do, to sketch out a letter from one of the following organisations to the Australian ministers, advocating for a particular policy program of action for Australia to address the inequities in the access to COVID vaccination. So you might choose to be the Australian Association for Global Solidarity, you might be the AMA, and you might be Medicines Australia, the peak body for the big pharma in Australia. The second exercise is in explaining complex ideas. And for this one, I'm asking that you prepare some dot points, which you could use in explaining to a non-expert layperson one of the following 3 issues. Why should we worry about inequitable access to COVID vaccination? What is the waiver proposal? And why is intellectual property regulated as a trade issue? Excuse me. Okay, that's the end. Thanks very much for your company. I hope you enjoy the exercises and the readings and the browsing. Cheers for now.